Today, the question is an African still holding the values, or an African has taken an image of another person? Has an African personified himself? Does he really remember who he was? Or does an African remember where he came from? But the question sounds so much ironical. And it seems sometimes it doesn't seem to have an answer. But again, if at all it doesn't hit into your bones and you really find the meaning of the question, it means that actually something really, really wrong has happened into our mind, and it really has damaged our African mentalism. The question is, who was an African before? Or who is an African after? Now, before and after what? Let's take a keen look of pre-colonization period. Who was an African before the pre-colonization period? Before the white man comes and an African taking a back seat to watch a white man arriving, a white man taking center stage of an African life. What was an African doing by then? An African was a hunter. An African was a gatherer. An African was a person, a communitarian human person. An African was somebody who would wake up in the morning, confirm if the neighbor is alive before proceeding to his daily duties. An African was a person whom the problem of the neighbor was his own problem. An African was a person who would think of the community more than himself. An African was a person who didn't have boundaries in helping. An African was a person who never had national boundaries. An African was a person who would gather anywhere. An African was a person who would go hunt anywhere. An African was a person who would bring what he has gathered together and they share as a community, as a family, as a society. An African was a person who would wake up with the family members, go try to gather together and come back celebrating. That was an African for you. An African who had no ego. An African who knew that the society came first. An African who knew that the community was the primordial than the self. An African was a person who would wake up to check if the climatic condition was suitable for the family members to get out. That was an African for you. An African was a person who would realize that here need change, and he wouldn't share change without being coerced or asked to do. That was an African. An African was not an educated person. Formal education, that is. An African was an instinctual man. A man who used his instincts to realize that there is a problem that needs to be solved. There is need that needs to be addressed. An African man was a person who would know that the pain of my friend, the pain of my brother is my pain. An African person is a person who would bear pain of the neighbor, who will grieve with the neighbor, who will celebrate with the neighbor, who will organize ceremonies with the neighbor, who will celebrate life with the neighbor. When a child is born, it is a communitarian celebration. It's not a family issue, it's a communitarian celebration. It is people coming together to celebrate the good grace of God. An African person was the person who would celebrate that the rain has come and he will cultivate the land. And whoever who will not have had enough energy to go to the farm, he will provide for him. That was an African. An African was a person who would have that conscious mind, a person who would think before making a decision. An African person is a person who would make the kids grow in a more virtuous way by showing it by them living the self. An African will lead and the kids will follow. An African will give the guidance, will share the stories, will give the moral guidance to the kids. The community for him was the first and primordial thing. That was an African before the pre-colonization. Let's take a keen look at an African after the or during the colonization period. An African is struggling. An African is in between. The mind is struggling to change from my Africanicity to the new colonization adaptations. An African is struggling to learn formal education. An African is a person who is subjected to a lot of labor because he seems to be so emotive. An African is forced to go and work, he's sold as a slave. An African tries to adjust to the new dynamics. The things have changed. This is not African way. Things are changing. An African is being subjected to putting on clothes. An African is being subjected now to have a lot of, to live outside the community. An African is now being subjected to hate the brother. An African is being told that the brother is his enemy. This is the colonization. An African is being colonized in the mind. It's being told that your friend is the one who has done this harm to you. An African is being trained to hate, is transiting from a well-moderated life to a life of solitude, to a life of having it all. This is an African now, is migrating and changing even in the mind. There is a substantial change in the mind of an African, where an African doesn't understand himself completely. He doesn't know if he should look back or go ahead. An African is coerced to do things. An African is told, if you don't do this, I'm going to whip, I'm going to kill you, I'm going to shoot you. An African is compromised. An African is forced to do things which he doesn't have to do, but he has to do it because he fears to be compromised, he fears to be killed. An African loses Africanicity. An African joins the bandwagon of the new civilization. An African forgets about what he was. He has been baptized in water and came out submerged. He has been promised heaven. An African was in heaven, but he's being promised heaven again. His ways are being devilified. They are being said he was worshipping a devil. He was worshipping a gods, not God. An African is confused, totally confused. He doesn't know what to do. An African is forced to embrace new religion. An African is forced to embrace new things which do not conform with him. He has no choice, but an African has to move because an African has nothing. He only has his neighbors whom he has now been separated with. That is all what African had. An African had the communitarian spirit, but it has been wiped away. An African has been told that your neighbor wanted to kill him. Now he has to be protected by the white. Is that not laughable? Is that not an irony? But now, let's take a keen look again. An African now, after the colonization, who is an African? Is he still an African? Should we call him a post-African, a post-modern Africa? Should we call him a post-African Africa? Is he really an African whom we talked before? Is he the primordial African that we dealt with in the beginning? No, he's not. He only bears the black text. He only bears the black melanin. But he is no longer an African. He has been swayed into believing that he is not an African. He has been swayed into believing that those who live in communities are barbaric, are savage, are not human persons. He has been made to believe that those who do not have money are not human persons. They are poor. Previously, an African never had a term like poverty. Previously, an African never had a thing like I own something, but rather we own. An African has been transformed to something else, to believing that he can stand on his own. And it is somehow insultive if I use the word African continuously, when in real sense this is something else. This is something which has been recreated into something else. He is no longer that African person who had the people's hearts in his heart. He is no longer that person who had that problems of people in his heart. He has been transfigured. He has been transformed. He has taken into a new shape. He has taken into a new look. He wants things to be done his ways. An African has forgotten his roots. He has forgotten that he used to heal himself with the herbs. He has forgotten that he used to go to the forest to look for food. He has forgotten, and he is now destroying the forest because of the civilization, because of the new civilization. An African has entered into a mental colonization. That he is colonized, that he forgets that it is nature that provided for him once. He is now hitting back at the nature like he never had nature as a friend. An African has forgotten that nature once provided for him. It is that nature that brought up what he is. He is now abusing the hand that fed it. He's now cutting trees, destroying the river banks and everything, the natural resources, because he wants to accumulate wealth. He wants to manufacture goods. That was not an African. That was not an African. But what happened actually? Let's come back. Let's take a keen look at what happened that an African is no longer an African anymore. When the white man arrives, he first disqualifies what an African was doing. He first disqualifies everything about an African. He disqualifies that a person cannot exist in a communitarian spirit of polygamy. He disqualifies that an African needs to worship the real God, and an African was worshiping something else, which is not God. An African is stereotyped to believe that what he was doing was wrong. An African is made to hate his previous life, and now is being caused to embrace the new life. Is that what an African wanted? Is that was the beginning? Is that what Africa wanted? Is that what we wanted as Africans? Should we ask that ourselves, or should we ask somebody else? But now, after having all this, after African beginning to learn the ways of the white and learning actually that they were barbaric and they were not as good as we thought, what have we as African done to unchain ourselves from these chains of the white and the barbaric man? What have we done to unchain ourselves from this religion, which makes us believe and hate our brothers and hate our neighbors that they are diabolic? What has an African done to unchain himself for the preoccupation of the mind that everybody is not good for me. What is an African doing to unchain his mind? That actually it was not good for me to believe this man. But rather the white or the African coronated himself to become something else. An African has become something which you can't even explain in a simple language because it is actually complicated. An African has taken another route. Even the white man has stepped back to watch. We lived in a communitarian spirit. We lived in a communitarian society. Now see where we have landed ourselves into. Who is laughing at us? The white man is laughing at an African again. Because an African was a project which has already been corrodified. That a white man has successfully made an African what he wanted to be. And he seated back at laughing at an African. Because an African is no longer weighing actions. He's just taking actions. We have made to believe that our life was not better. The conditioning that we went through is that what we were doing was not better. We were not better in ourselves. We had to borrow a new self into us so that we can actually fit in the society. Is that what an African wanted? Is that what our primordial idea was? Is that what our African man wanted to be? Is here where we wanted to be? A society where we don't care about the high rising of the food, the high cost of living. Is that what an African wanted? That so long as I'm able to feed my stomach, that is all. I don't care about my neighbor. I don't care about my brother. Is there any other term as brotherhood again still existing in the African vocabulary? Is a brother or a neighbor vocabulary still existing in an African dictionary? Have we forgotten that we were communitarian before? Just because I'm able to amass a few wealth, I have to forget about who doesn't have. Is that what an African wanted to be? Is that what we wanted to be? I've been confronted with so much postmodernism. I've been confronted with a lot of people who call themselves civilized. They will tell me that you are heading in the wrong direction. You are heading back to the caves. Am I heading to the caves? Am I talking something which can be of substance to the society? Am I, my own world? Can we not recreate our society again? Can we not revamp our mind again? Can we go back to our roots again? Can't we go back to the communitarian spirit we had again? Is this what we wanted as Africans? Did we have these boundaries all over as Africans? Did we have even the tribes? Did we know even what the tribe mean? What have we got these new terms which have come to segregate us, these fringe rises, make us so much malicious? Where have we gained this new knowledge that we cannot recognize that my neighbor is also in need? We have adopted the new capitalistic mind that we don't even care who is existing besides me. So long as I'm able to breathe, the rest I don't care. Is that what an African wanted? Is that the society? Is that the utopic society that we wanted to be in? Should we call that this is the post-modernism that we wanted? Is this the civilization that we wanted? That I'm here with my brothers, we cannot talk, but I'm able to talk to somebody who is abroad. Do we realize how our society has been broken? Do we realize how our bond has been broken? Are we really comfortable with this? I've always asked myself a question of the white man. The white man coming to Africa and making Africa look actually so much devolic. An African was made to be like a thing which actually did not have even a sense of reason in it. An African was made to think that to even have that low self-esteem, to even have a discussion with a white man. Because the white man was even afraid of approaching an African, thinking it was not even a human person. But now that African realizing this, he embraced the white culture and forgot about everything about himself. Is this what we want to be? Is our society not rotting? If not rotten, are we not only concerned with our monetary satisfaction, forgetting about our virtual satisfaction? Forget about religion, forget about the moral teachings and everything. As human persons, being led by that intrinsic and instinctual guide which we had, that am I able to realize that I cannot on my own, that I need my neighbor to grow, I need my brother to share. The world has turned into something else that no one cares. We only meet during funeral contributions. We only meet during funeral gatherings. I can't tell you how many cousins I have for sure. I can't. I can't tell you how many nephews I have. I don't know. Why? Because the life has become so much confined into myself, but not ourselves. Is it my mistake that I don't know my nephews or my nieces? Is it my problem that I have to care about them? So long as I'm able to feed myself, so long as I'm able to have a very poshy life, is that what an African was? Is that what we wanted to be? Let's take a look. Let's take a keen look. Let's take a discussion. I need you people to give me your views. Should we go back, or this is the way to go? Don't forget to subscribe. Don't forget to like. Don't forget to share. Don't forget to comment so that we know actually, is this the African we wanted, or there's something we need to do for us to achieve our common good as an African society. Thank you.